Whatever time you're tuning in the program called What's Going On FlintTalkRadio.com. I'm George Moss, the host of the program, and we are very delighted to see you out there this afternoon at 2 o'clock, and we come on every Monday from 2 to 3. And, of course, we have every second and fourth Mondays preceding the program called Satori's Black History Corner that comes on at 3:30, and it lasts about 30 minutes from 3:30 to about 4. Every second and fourth Mondays of the month. But we are here every Monday, and we will be here, rain, shine, sleet, or snow. It's not snowing right now, by the way, but they're predicting more snow. And how many of us are now looking for Al Gore to give him a punch? That's not a fruit punch, but a punch right on the noggin, because he told us that there was global warming. Now we're told that global warming is causing global cooling. Somebody go figure that one out and show me the science.
You cast as wide as a net as you can, so eventually you might be considered correct on something that happens. I mean, that's what we're going to do. It's like, so why don't you just come on and say something's going to happen with the weather at some point?
Right. It's going to eventually change. We wait long enough, the weather will in fact change. It was global. There's climate change now. That's the latest one they backed up to. It was global cooling in 1979, I think it was. And then it went to global warming when they saw there were two bears out there on a piece of ice up there at the Arctic, and then they had to decide what that meant. And what that meant, of course, is that there was global warming, not knowing that bears don't hunt in groups because they don't bring down the big prey that lions bring down in Africa, for example, where when you're bringing a buffalo down, one jumps on his back and then tries to break his spine, and the other one grabs him under his throat. And then one cuts off the naval passage, the nose, and as a group attack, they are all bringing down a ton of meat. And then the 13 that jumped on him can share the ton of meat together. It's hard to do that when you're hunting fish and maybe a seal or two, and there's not that much meat to go around for that many animals. But when they saw two bears, and then having been raised with Goldilocks and the three bears, they saw the two bears there. Then they knew that the bears were disappearing, and now we got to spend $1 billion on changing the climate in order to get the global warming out of here, as if we haven't heard of the Ice Age 10,000 years ago, where the globe had to warm in order for the Ice Age to come to a close.
And that's before one smokestack was put up in any plant or factory. And that's before anybody drove a vehicle of any sorts to burn fossilized fuels. I mean, the climate's changing. I mean, and I don't think we should pollute. I mean, that should be a no-brainer. But to go around saying they can predict stuff like this, I mean, they've seemed to miss the mark. And I don't know.
You can tell when they are beginning to get into an area where they don't know what they're talking about. They start using words they don't think anybody understands. And we were told that the vortex of the polar cap. And when they start using that kind of jargon, that means that they don't want you involved in the conversation. They want you outside as they tell you what the facts are.
Well, shouldn't have been kind of a way of dismissing the entire argument that Al Gore was making anyway. Because look at it, he wanted to be part of this group that actually had the ability to sell credits towards people who are polluting. Mm-hmm. Why was he, if this is a shared planet, why were he and his cronies could be the only ones gaining financially off of this kind of venture? Mm-hmm. I didn't hear him splitting the wealth up with everybody else. It was him and his friends, and they stood to make more money than God could ever make. You know?
These people have to be understood in the context of who they are. These people believe that we have our wealth through ill-gotten gains. And if you listen to them, as I was listening to one of Obama's mentors, Bill Ayers, in his debate with Dinesh D'Souza, he was talking about how we had killed off the Indians and took their land, and then, of course, the wealth we have, that's because we were colonizing the rest of the world and taking their resources. And when you look at these people who are guilt-ridden, thinking that we have our wealth because the rest of the world is poor. They want to redistribute our wealth and give it to the poor, give it to other nations that do not have what we have. And so the global climate issue is a chance for them to hide behind another facade they created I mean, they've created a number of other facades preceding that. The idea that we kill off the Native Americans is nonsense. You have those mustards coming over here, you're going to decimate 100 million Native Americans. What you had there was the diseases that populations always bring when they travel, and the population that they in fact travel to are not inoculated against those diseases those groups bring. If you think there's some phenomena that it was unique to the Western Hemisphere, go look at what happened in terms of the bubonic plague, where the Asians went into Europe and brought those rats from Asia on those boats. And then the sewage, which was not able to withstand this infestation that occurred because of that, caused the Black Death that you've all heard about, have not yet understood why that occurred, and it wiped out a whole population of Europeans and set that continent back. So let's talk about why that happened. This was not Genghis Khan and Attila the Hun and those persons.
Well, here's an interesting
doing that.
Here's an interesting thing too, though. You brought it up in a way about the germ theory. Basically, we use germ warfare. They said that we traded blankets with Indians we knew were infested with smallpox virus. Well, if that's the case, then how come Ignaz Semmelweis, who was a physician in Vienna, was given the credit for finding this? There's a connection between doctors examining cadavers and then coming back and working with living female patients, creating pudendal fever, and they're dying of pudendal fever. Or pudendal fever, whatever it's called. Anyway, they found a connection. It was simply just washing their hands after examining the cadavers and working with them, and then coming in to see their patients, just simply washing their hands before dealing with their patients, cut back on the rate of pudendal fever rate, deaths. Mm-hmm. Okay, so that was germ theory discovered in the late Victorian era.
That's
They're
right.
attributed back in the 1700s. So which one is it?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, did we have an awareness of germ theory before?
There was no awareness of it, and they want to go back and say, because here's what they're doing. They're saying because that was the effect, then that was in fact the plan to bring that about. Nobody would say that they put those rats on those ships going into Europe was because it was intended by the Asians to wipe out the European population. Nobody makes that claim. But when it comes down to looking at this from a Western standpoint, then the revisionists, and that's what they are, they're revisionists of history, will come behind the fact and then import melody into what occurred. And so we look at decimated populations and other venues, and we do not import any bastardy types of explanations behind it. We understand that that's what happens when populations mix with each other, and there's one population not inoculated against the diseases brought on the shores. But when it happens here, there's got to be some melody that's in place that explains it. And what explains it, of course, by the radicals like Bill Ayers and others, is that they took their muskets out. I don't know if you've seen this in the Civil War, where they had you shoot, and then you got to plunge that powder down in there and then fire the next shot. And I want to know how many Native Americans be waiting around until that happens, and then they don't have anything to fight with, and they're just waiting for you to load up and then shoot them again. This is nonsense. But that's the kind of thing that's being taught as history, as a way of developing Western guilt. And the West is the only place on the planet, by the way, that feels guilty for anything that's happened. Feels guilty about slavery, which everybody was practicing. Feels guilty about being on the land space when everybody's on the land space that didn't belong to them originally. And that's the transportation that goes on from one group to another based upon the firepower they bring to the shores and other things that occur. Sometimes it's not about the firepower, it's just the fact that a population arrives and the one that is on the shores will not withstand the bacterial infestation that takes place. And that wipes out a population. And I'm sure if you go and look in history, you'll find that there were some lands in Europe that were not occupied and became occupied later on by groups that were not there indigenous to the territory. That's just history. And I don't know why we can't see it holistically, and we look at it through a very limited lens when it comes down to some groups, and then we don't apply the same standard to other groups.
How about the Japanese and the white groups called the Ainu or the Emishi on the islands of what the Japanese now inhabit? Those people who lived there before the Japanese did were white. Mm-hmm. There's still a remnant of the population. I think
Sure.
in the northernmost island, but nobody. I mean, it's like it's just okay. But it's the European malaise. This idea of genocide.
Yeah,
Well, it wasn't.
That's the thing that really gets you in terms of and of course groups. I just read the other day where in Latin America, Jamaica, and some other nations are now making a demand. I think it's like 11 countries that have joined on to making a demand that Britain would pay reparations to them because of the fact that they enriched themselves by the slave trade and by slavery in the islands. It's like, all of the attributes of slavery were going one way. There were no gains being made by anyone other than the colonialists. And that's so much rubbish that you really have to stop and pause at the audacity of someone making that claim, is that the benefits can go only one way. And I don't know why anyone today, looking at what the indigenous circumstances are in the places where those slaves came from, would make the claim that they ought to be paid reparations when their condition is in fact better. You can certainly make a claim that the ones in the field that are working in those fields were due some restitution, but they're not here anymore. And their descendants did not go through that, did not do that work, and their situation has been better because of it. And you can say that because they paid that particular debt, their situation is better today than any person's on the continent of Africa.
And now, see, I want to pursue this. I mean, if they want reparations for the British for enslavement and for slavery and all that stuff, then I want free Italian food every time I walk in an Italian restaurant, because my ancestors were enslaved by Romans. Okay? Every time I walk into Luigi's or a place with a distinctly Italian name, I want a free dinner.
Yeah.
Okay, because Gaelic and Celtic people were enslaved by the Celts were enslaved, and Germanic people, a lot of them, were enslaved by the Romans. I want free meals. Okay, so let's continue with that.
Yeah, you can see how ridiculous the argument gets, because everybody would owe everybody something based on the fact that everyone at some point has been victimized by someone else. No one lives in an island. And at some point, whoever's in control now weren't in control always in the past. And that's the forward movement of history. And when you start talking about somebody owes you, then the question comes down to, who do you owe? Because there's some of that in your own background, and no one is innocent here. Once we understand history, we can stop making ourselves appear ridiculous based upon the claims that history makes upon us in the present. Because we all have something in the past of all groups that each one can make a case against, and that's not just in terms of what the West has done. We're coming. The reason I wore this outfit, I wore this hat last week, but I added to it today, is because you don't think we're celebrating Black History unless somebody puts on kente cloth, and I see these persons wearing kente cloth on these college campuses. By the way, no Africans, unless they're from Ghana, will wear kente cloth. We got three persons from the continent of Africa that are from the continent that are now in the department at the university, and not a single one of them wears kente cloth. And that's because two of them are from Nigeria, and the other person is from Ethiopia. And sometimes we'll have an African affair, and there are some that come from the Cameroon, that's right below Nigeria, and from other parts of Africa, some from the Côte d'Ivoire, the Ivory Coast, some are from Sierra Leone. And you never see them wearing kente cloth, because kente cloth is indigenous to one part of the population, and people who cannot even claim that they know where they came from as far as the ancestral background is concerned are wearing kente cloth as if this is comprehensive throughout Africa, which shows their ignorance.
Just like back in the 70s, I remember all the TV shows about the awareness of Black history and the lack of it, and they're always talking about my Swahili name and saying expressions in Swahili, and I always accepted that. I thought, but it's almost they made it sound there was this lingua franca of the entire African continent, and it really wasn't. It was isolated on the eastern coast of Africa, wasn't it?
Right. Yeah. It's only in the eastern part of Africa. It is a language, one of the three languages that if you speak it, you can be kind of coherent in many parts of Africa, but that's an indigenous language. That's a hybrid language that's created out of indigenous languages in African and Arabic, and because of the fact that the Middle Eastern influence comes out of the eastern part of that area, you have it as Eastern language, and there's some importation of it to the West as well. But you can go into parts of Africa and you will not be coherent no matter how much Swahili you had, because it's not comprehensive everywhere, mostly in the eastern part of Africa, more so than anywhere else. Yet the persons over here will be speaking Kiswahili and bragging about it, and then as if they don't know that most of the persons brought here from Africa were brought here from the western part of Africa. There was a slave trade to the eastern part of Africa, but that's a slave trade that's controlled by the Arabs. And the slave trade over here that was controlled by the Arabized blacks was in fact slave trade controlled by persons on the continent of Africa, but these were Arabized blacks, and some of them were not Arabized. Some of them were just warrior groups that were able to defeat other people on the continent of Africa that did not see themselves as African, but saw themselves as part of whatever indigenous group they belonged to, and they captured the less warlike, or the group that was more vulnerable, and placed them in slavery. And they had, according to George Oyete, they had three different choices. What are they going to do with the person that they in fact captured? And they had three different choices: to feed them, put them in some penal place, and feed them for the rest of their lives. Let them mix with the population, to which they are a danger because they are jumping at the bits that have been captured. That's a danger. Or, well, there's a fourth thing too. They could kill them, or they can sell them into captivity. And they chose the more lucrative angle in it. And what they're doing is selling their captives into slavery. Without that process going on, there would have been no slave trade. And that's why Bassel Davison changed the name of his book. He had a book called African Mother. But when he began to do further studies into the West African history, he saw that the slave trade was really driven by what was going on in the continent of Africa. Without that participation, it would never have occurred. So he then changed the name of the book from African Mother to the African Slave Trade. He did not call it the European Slave Trade, because how is it European slave trade when the Europeans are not the ones who are ultimately indigenously involved in the trafficking of the slaves? They could not have gone into the interior part of Africa and captured those slaves, and were not even allowed in there. And those of you who disagree with this, you disagree with it based upon the wrong information that you've been given. But I was sitting right next to the person that explored this on the continent of Africa, one of whom is in Louis Gates' piece. I made it a point, by the way, at a dinner that I went to that she was at, Dr. Kosher Prairie, who is Ashanti and lives in Ghana, teaches at the University of Ghana at Legon. I was there living on that campus for a period of time, talked to the professors there about a lot of things. And I won't go into all the details, but one of the conversations we had was about the slave trade. And every professor was there, including the one that is now deceased, but at that time was the one that was the editor of the 7th volume of A General History of Africa, put out by UNESCO. And there are 8 volumes there, but the 7th volume is called the colonialism starting in 1880 to 1935, which is volume 7. And the editor was a guy named A. Adu Bowen, one of the profound professors that was respected historian in Africa, was from Ghana. And he was, of course, making the point very clear in his writings that this was indigenously driven. We have this idea that colonialism and slavery are the same thing in Africa. And they get really upset when they go read chapter 2 of this volume 7, where the writer, I think this is a Nigerian writer, who wrote chapter 2 of that volume that was edited by Adadu Bowen. And he stated on the first page of chapter 2 of volume 7, go check it out yourself, and he says that Africa, unbeknownst to most persons that are writing about African history and claim to be an expert on it, that Africa was the last continent to be colonized. Now go tell that to somebody who think that they kicked the doors in 1441 when the slave trade started, and you're going to have your feelings hurt, because Africa wasn't colonized until after the slavery had been abolished in the Western Hemisphere, because you don't have the colonization of Africa until really begins at the Berlin Conference in 1884, where they met in Berlin and began to try to decide what they're going to do with the continent of Africa. And they did the carving of Africa up at that particular conference, but they had not conquered it yet. And the conquest of Africa really is going on up until 1935, with the Italians going into Ethiopia at that time to avenge the Italians trying to take over Ethiopia at that time back in 1896, where they thought they were going to go in there and take over a piece of the real estate, and they ran into, go read about it in the book written by called Empress Tetu and Menelik II. And that book is one of the more profound books I've read on the, and of course you can read some other books as well, but that's one of the more profound books I've read on what occurred between the Italians and the Ethiopians who were fighting for independence, and they defeated the Italians and sent them back in a tailspin because they had not yet conquered that continent at that point. They were still, the conquest was ongoing, and it did not reach its ultimate place of the colonial ascendancy until the 1930s. By that time, I think we'll all admit, by that time, slavery had ended in the United States. It had ended in the British Empire in 1831. And we had cut the slave trade out in the United States, officially and legally been cut out in 1808 because of the passages put in the Constitution in Article 1, Section 2, Clause 3, which you call it the, I'm sorry, not Article 1, Section 2, Clause 3, it's Article 1, Section 9. That would be the one in which it said that the slave trade could not be interfered with for 20 years. But what happened was when the Constitution was ratified, and first of all drawn up in 1787, later on ratified the following year, when they could not cut the slave trade out for 20 years, but what they were doing was waiting for the 20-year period was over. And it's very interesting that as soon as they were able to cut the slave trade out, they did so. They didn't do so 20 years after it would have been allowed to go on. They did it the very year that was allowed to be cut out. And I think people ought to pay attention to that and understand what that means. And very few understand even that aspect of the history of the trafficking of slaves and so on and so forth. That's why Douglas was right in saying that the Constitution, even though it did not initially prohibit slavery, is an anti-slavery document, because every part of its vestiges was in fact restricted. You can't always go for the whole loaf. You have to go sometimes and do things incrementally until the conditions prevail that allow you to do what was really intended here. But how are you going to be able to bring states together at the formative part of the country's history, and then you're going to cut out an institution that was in fact vibrant throughout the world, and it was no less the case with 12 to 13 colonies here in the United States, but it's not unique to the United States. That's the point that Bill Ayers was missing in his discussion with Dinesh D'Souza at Dartmouth University, where Dinesh D'Souza took Bill Ayers to school. And I wish Obama had been there, because he needs to go to school too, because he doesn't know anything.
Which African nations never were totally colonized? I mean, you talked about Ethiopia. In my recollection, they were never actually colonized totally by a Western power for any length of time. I mean, the Italians tried it as soon as, it wasn't that long when their presence was, pushed away in Ethiopia. And I think there's another country, and there's like 2 or 3 countries in Africa that never was colonized, wasn't there?
And you're making an excellent point that we shouldn't skirt over either, and that is when you say colonized, you mean there was a European presence on the land space, but when you look in terms of how total the colonial presence was, it was never in total, because in the countryside, and you see it in Africa right now, you go to Africa, you see that on the periphery where the Europeans were, you find more development, but it's mostly in the city areas. In the countryside, you see the rate of primitive development in the places where Europeans were not housed. And I want people to be aware of the fact that we had in 2010, when I was in Africa in 2010, they had the Olympics of football. We know that is soccer, but they call it football. And they had the World Cup. That's like the Super Bowl of soccer. And the World Cup was held in South Africa. You go look at South Africa on the map, and you notice that it is on the edges of the African continent. And ask yourself the question, because when I'm in Nigeria, I see the same thing. When I go to Gambia, I see the same thing. And I see it in Ghana. All these are coastal parts of Africa. But go into the interior of Africa, where there's less development. Go into what is called the Congo. Central African Republic. Go to those places and look at development there, where there's an absence of the European presence. And ask yourself the question, how do you have this great contrast between the coastal parts of Africa, which is well developed and so on and so forth, and then when you go into the interior, you see less development? Why would that be the case? And if you understood that, you stop this foolishness of calling it for reparations. Understand that no colonial power has ever just brought the military on the shores. They bring development there too, because without development, there can be no military power. I hope America learns that lesson, because as we're beginning to undercut our own economic wherewithal in this country, you're going to see a decline in our military apparatus as well, because you cannot sustain a military unless there's some development where even if it's stolen, even if it's stolen wealth from where the wealth was accumulated and where you came from, if the wealth is not there, you can't do the things that an army does, because the army's got to be paid.
Well, the other thing is, too, South Africa, for example, you alluded to it already, it still has vast mineral resources. I mean, it so does all these countries. I mean, they weren't totally exhausted by the colonial powers. Those resources largely still exist. But it just seems corrupt government and violence and stuff like that is set in, so economic development hasn't been able to come through to the masses. And that's what the thing is. And see, like, a lot of, like, I've had people, I've argued this when I was on college campus. They're always saying, well, you're trying to excuse colonialism. No, I'm not. I mean, there's always been a bizarre situation for me trying to criticize being colonized by the British, and then be condoning it with the United States. But what happened is, when Europe started doing the colonization efforts, they did till they exhaust everything. They're still there. Why, after Britain, France, and all these other countries had a colonial base in those countries, have been, I think the last ones left in the 60s. My last count, I'm 50. I was born in 63. Why haven't they been able to continue just basically utilizing resources and exploiting their natural resources, those colonial powers did, and contribute to the wealth of the nation overall? No, it's usually wants a group of people, tribal or whatever, familiar connections, trying to vie for it, and just battle it all amongst themselves, and everybody gets trounced on in the process.
You're making, John, you understand it because you read, and you analyze what you read. A lot of people who are the he said, she said school don't read for themselves and don't know what the facts are, and they are shocked, traumatized, quite frankly, if you tell them what the facts are. You can wear all the kidney cloth you want to, but if you don't go and examine the record, you would be misappropriating what really happened, because all you do is parroting what somebody else said. Even if you're sitting in these college classrooms with these Afro-centrists, and most of them don't know what they're talking about. And that's why when I'm writing a 5-part series this week. Started it 2 days ago, and this will be the third part when I finish it today. And I invite them to come on those posts and argue their position publicly on what I am writing here. And I know they're not going to come out of the woodwork, because they cannot face the light of day with the nonsense that they're talking about, and they're not going to challenge it publicly. But if you're out there, welcome to the discussion. But you're not going to have a nice day, because you're writing from a theoretical standpoint, and what the theoreticals are nothing other than you're attempting to do one-upmanship on people like Hugh Traver Roper and Arnold Toynbee. M.D. W. Jefferson wrote a piece in 1951 called The Negro Enigma, which was an enigma to M.D. W. Jefferson, because he's looking for the contribution of blacks among the orangutans and not among human population. And what these Afro-Centrists have done is gone behind people like M.D. W. Jefferson and Hugh Traver Roper and Arnold Toynbee and some of the others, and overcorrected and made the same mistake that they made. Which is to delve into nonsense and passing off as history. I'm not, as I said in my second piece of this 5-part series, I'm not impressed with either side, because both of them are bogus and both are talking nonsense. And I dare you, you scholars, I don't care how many degrees you got. That's a mistake that the professor out there in California made, and he knows who I'm talking about, and I know you're going to tell him that I said it. I mean, this is not don't ask, don't tell. This is please tell. and he jumped on the wall. I was talking to someone else. He jumped on the wall and immediately went into discussion of Egypt. And I refused the engagement first in a conversation. He thought I was trying to avoid the conversation because he was making a claim that, this is a claim these Afro-Centrists make, that Greece had no civilization before the Egyptians taught them the Egyptian philosophy. And I hate to break it to you, but I had to tell him that this thesis that you put forward basically comes out of the argumentation put out by people like Sheikh Anthony Diop. You call him Diop over here, but Jope over there in Senegal, where I was. And I was over at the Diop Institute. And you can make the claim, but Diop was wrong in his assessment. And when you go to and start with Diop, and that's why I want to start with him, by the way. I want to start at the very top of the food chain, because once I can dismiss some of the claims made by Diop, which I think made some fundamental mistakes in his analysis, and once I went and challenged Diop and some analysis that he made, this person got really quiet because he thought I was gonna go around and then Diop's gonna be the final word. I started with Diop and stated some things that were very profound in terms of what Diop had claimed that no longer can be sustained by Diop's argument. Although Diop was a scholar in his own right, but there were too many ideological things that were blinding him to looking at the facts totally also. And this idea that you can put black people in European history, but there are no Europeans in Egypt's history is nothing other than madness. And I see that as nothing other than a reflection, an ideological reflection of the people that they are critiquing, such as Traylor Roper and Toynbee and M.D.W. Jeffers. They're just reflecting the same nonsense from another standpoint and taking a white line and making it black, and then acting like they've created something new.
Well, see, the presence of the Ptolemy family being in Egypt, Cleopatra, the one we always talk about usually, was the 6th or 7th or 8th one of the Cleopatra. So if it was a conspiracy, it was started almost close to 3,000 years ago to exclude and to able to write themselves into history and weave themselves seamlessly into it, and now it's just being discovered. I find that highly doubtful. I mean, another thing is a lot of these people are these revisionists. I'm open for the idea that a lot of history hasn't been recorded, but what they're coming up with seems to be just pulled out of the air, and there is no justification for it, no physical archaeological evidence, no written evidence of that era, no first-hand accounts or anything. Yet, I'm supposed to believe it as some form of gospel.
Yeah, I what I'm after is the truth, and I don't really care where the pendulum falls on whatever side of the divide. What is the truth? In other words, the mistake ultimately that was made in terms of a correction of Eurocentrism is not Afro-centrism, but the correction will be what happened. What is the truth of what happened? And you can substitute an ism for another ism, but that ism can be wrong also. The question is, what do the facts? When you look at the evidence, what does the evidence say should have been the conclusion in the first place? Because we don't need to have an initial mistake made and then people come behind it trying to correct it with other misinformation. And that's what the Afro-Centrists have fallen into, a trap of their own making. But they're not going to come. You're not going to. I tell you what, you're not going to do. You're not going to get on that wall. The person in California, you don't get on that wall and argue this publicly. You're not going to do that. In fact, that's why you get off the wall when we started making the arguments in public in the first place. You thought you had. You can talk. I know who walls you walk right on quite a bit out there in California. He's a computer person, but I'm a historian just like you are. And when I got on that wall to tell you that you're talking nonsense, and you're going to try to use your PhD as if I care about how many degrees you got, and so when you got on the wall and started arguing that nonsense, and you saw that you didn't have the monopoly you thought you had on the conversation, you got off that wall real quick, and I can get you back on there. And, get on this wall. And I've written 2 pieces. I'll be doing the 3rd piece later on this afternoon. I dare any of you to get on any of it and come out and play. And let's see what you have to say about it. Because I can tell you right now that you're not going to have a good day, because what you're doing is on these university campuses, what you're doing is using your ghettoization of information as a way of gaining tenure. and you want to claim that any objection to the things that you're teaching on these college campuses is nothing other than an objection because people are racist, not because of the lack of scholarship on your part. And all of you Egyptologists, all of you who call yourself Egyptologists, none of you can read the language. And that's that. And how do you claim to be an Egyptologist and you can't read the Meta Nature or the what the Greeks call the hieroglyphs? That's impossible, because in order to decipher what the Egyptians who they were, you got to be able to read what they wrote. And I don't know of any living so-called black scholars in the African Studies departments in this country who can read the language. And if you can, you are the single exception, whoever that one person is. But it's not the person out there in California, because he can't read it. And so that this argument that we've gotten off into has been a disservice to what Carter G. Woodson intended in 1926 when he set up Negro History Week. He didn't set it up as an Afro-centrist. He set it up as a historian, as a scholar, to make the corrections so that those persons that were distorting history could then put into what was called world history all of it or some of it that had been left out deliberately, and wanted to place it in there. So when you're discussing history, you discuss it from the standpoint of what occurred. He wasn't making anything up. And they cannot say that Carter, Godwin, Woodson would have endorsed what they've done with his song. And the song was, let's get a wedge in the door and call it Negro History Week, because they're not going to even let it be a month at that time. It wasn't a month until 50 years later. But he did the same thing, and that's another thing I think we need to point out. What Carter G. Woodson did was something similar to what the Founding Fathers did in terms of growing slavery out of existence. That you can't just simply in a fail swoop say, look, slavery out of here, and you got 12 states practicing it. You got to, in fact, go what you have to get to where you want to go. And what Carter G. Woodson did was something very similar to that. He only asked for a week. And he wanted to put it to show you that, and look at what he did with that, to show you that he was trying to be fair and balanced in it and not accusatory. He put the Negro History Week in 1926 in the month where they had two persons, one black, one white, on both sides of the racial divide. The month of February is the month in which Frederick Douglass was born. We now know Douglass was born in 1818 rather than 1817, which is the year he thought he was born. We now know the records indicate he was born in 1818. We can trace that now and go back to that particular point. But it was in February. He was off by 1 year of his own dating. And so was Lincoln born in February. And so what Carter G. Woodson had in mind was, let's take these two pivotal figures in history during the time of the slavery conditions in this country, and let's look at that historical moment and the historical events of what he called Negro history, and let's frame it around the time period in which these two giants of the 19th century can be the rallying point to which we engage in this study. That's pretty fair and pretty balanced. And I don't think Carter G. Woodson would endorse any of the things that have been done with it by those persons that walk around here with this kente cloth on these college campuses trying to terrorize people as if they have some monopoly on what the truth is. You know, nobody has any monopoly on it. And if you talk it out of the other side of your mouth, and and you correcting someone that talked out of one side of their mouth, and your mouth is twisted the same way, I don't see that as correction. I see it as piling on to the problem that you claim to be trying to address. You're part of the problem too.
Call that United. You call it Negro History Week, not Negro Mythology Week.
Yes, that's what he called it, Negro History Week, and he endorsed the fact that this was a Negro History Week. He didn't call it African American Week, and didn't wear. I never saw Carter G. Woodson wear anything other than a business suit. I never saw him in. I just wore this because I know if I'm talking about Black history, and when I speak at this church next Sunday, during the closing ceremony of Black History Month at this particular church, I'll wear probably the hat and that just because to give an appearance of it, but I'm not at all I'm not at all deluded into thinking that this is who blacks are over here in the United States. In fact, it's ridiculous when you go to Africa and you start seeing that this idea of African American. There's not a person on the continent of Africa that buys into that as a specific designation of who blacks are in this country. And if blacks understood what they're saying, they would understand how ridiculous it is on this side of the water. And that is to say that you are a continental African, as if you can say you were everywhere on the continent. And there are 54 countries now on the continent of Africa. Then there's some people off the shores. But on the continent itself, there are 54 different countries, with Southern Sudan now being independent and being a nation. And to say that you are an African American as if that is something that designates you, that's a designation you can use, as if it is a specific designation of a reference to a group on the continent, is outrageously ridiculous. Because there in just one country, you can go to people that are different on the same land space in the same country that will be different from the ones next door. I'll take Nigeria as an example. Nigeria has the Yoruba in the western part of Nigeria, but on the eastern part, in the Delta area, you'll have the Igbo, and I'm an Igbo chief. And you go into the Igbo and try to interface that with the Yoruba, and you're going to find that there are some major differences between those two cultures, and they're inside the same country. So the idea that you are African, which is the whole continent, and then American, is really quite remote from anything that's accepted on the continent of Africa. I have many different experiences with that in different countries that I've been into. But if you're not traveling and not into those places to have that conversation, you can really be misled by believing that you're saying something very specific in terms of the reference point. I'll tell you another thing. I went to Winnie Mandela was a speaker at the Million Woman March, because after they had the Million Man March the following year, they wanted to have a Million Woman March, which was held in, I think it was held in Philadelphia, if my memory serves me correctly. And the Million Man March, of course, was in Washington, where black men went to protest their own behavior. Somebody make some sense out of that for me. That's the first time in human history where people got together, rallied 1 million people, according to their count, and then went to the nation's capital and protested what they were doing. I've never seen that before in history. Made no demands on anybody. Went up there and demanded they stop behaving inappropriately.
I never thought about that, but that's, it's like the biggest threat to the African American community, the black community in this country, are other blacks. And if you say that to them, then they get mad. But that was an unconscious admittance that to be true. Because why would they go to Washington not to do what King did? Was when he came there, King went there and said that we came here to Washington to cash a promissory note. In other words, the Emancipation Proclamation. And that's where he started out talking. He said 5 score years ago, a great American, talking about Lincoln, whose symbolic image we stand today, signed the Emancipation Proclamation. But 100 years later, the Negro is still not free. He was talking about the fact that we had not yet had the voting rights that was actually being commandeered in the South at that time. But the following year, they passed the Civil Rights Act, and then they passed the Voting Rights Act the year after that. So 2 years after King gave his speech, he could no longer say the fulfillment had not occurred, because now the voting rights are being reinstituted to the point of being enforced by the party that was in fact stopping it from being enforced, Democratic Party. And because they had now gotten on board through Johnson, they're going to stop discriminating in the voting and balloting in this country, in the South, then it can be stopped. And all it did was repeat the bill that had been passed under the Eisenhower administration, but now the Democrats bought into it, and that's why it was able to become part of the political landscape at that point. And so then at that point, King could not have gone in 66 to Washington and made that same claim. But in the Million Man March, they went to Washington, and what they were protesting in terms of the atonement, they call it at-one-ment.
but they were talking about the black community being at one with itself. And it was a protest where they were protesting their own conduct, apologizing to black women with their, and then to make it, and then what was so bad, what was so remarkable about it, I won't say hypocritical, because I don't think they were consciously aware of the implication of what they were in fact saying. But the implications are very clear. That, and then the hypocrisy is that if you're going to make an apology to black women, at least let them be present. This is a Million Man March. The women were in fact excluded. Only a few of them could get up there and speak, because this was a man thing. And they were protesting men's behavior in terms of these men walking off from their families, now to the tune of 75%. And the spotlight was put on themselves, but here they are calling a meeting where they are meeting to protest what they're doing. And that was the gist of that. But if you say that in terms of making that particular claim, then you are, sell out, and you all these names like to give. The people that are pointing these people out about they're doing this and doing that. Look at those three fingers that are underneath making an indictment. As you pointed one thing out, don't forget those three fingers are subtly making another indictment, pointing back the opposite way, and making an indictment that you need to pay more attention to, you pointers, because you don't fool me. That's why when I get on the post and make my claims, I don't care I don't really care what you say, because you're not going to move me. I don't know how Clarence Thomas feels about what you say about him, but I could care less about what you say. And I don't think Clarence Thomas cares about it, quite frankly, because he is moving on down the road and has not stopped and turned back yet. Let me say this too, because I want to say a few things about the book I brought before we get off the air. But let me say this also, because I like to kind of free flow on the air. And here's an argument they make, since this is Black History Month. I might as well clean some other things up too. Here's what they say about Clarence Thomas. I heard this just the other day through this buffoon named Mark Lamont Hill, who was on, a rally put him on and made him popular on national television. He's another fruitcake over there at Columbia University. And he doesn't know what he's talking about. He came to the university here in this city and spoke, and I had to send him and ask him a question. One day we'll get into how that conversation went. But I went down after it was over and said a few words to him. I didn't wait for his comment because I had nothing to say to a person that ignorant. But and so anyway, the point that they make now against Clarence Thomas, and this is what Mark Lamont Hill was saying, that here he was taking advantage of affirmative action himself. He went to Yale University under affirmative action. Now he gets up there on the Supreme Court and he's closing off the doors to all the ones coming behind him, as if this guy was being disingenuous in terms of there's something available to him, a tool that he could use. And it's not that he actually used the affirmative action tool. This guy's a scholar. They got this idea that Clarence Thomas is some nutcase. I guess you go read. There's a book out called Simple Justice. Don't let Clarence Thomas fool you up there in the Supreme Court. In terms of, he had one article saying Clarence Thomas spoke for the first time in 5 years on the Supreme Court. Well, the man's a listener. And if you wait long enough, if you're not trying to get your name out there in print and you're not so full of yourself, if you got 9 people on the Supreme Court bench and all of them are asking questions, you don't all need to ask questions. Why don't someone just listen and get the answer by the question being asked and discern what the answers are that you want to have met? But because he doesn't ask a lot of questions, they want to say he doesn't know anything up there. All he is Scalia light, and he doesn't, and Souter, and those persons are his mentors, and he's a parrot, and he didn't know anything. But here's what they say about Clarence Thomas as far as him closing doors on affirmative action. They say, well, he took advantage of it, and now he's on the Supreme Court, and look what he's doing in terms of affirmative action. Let me ask you all a question, Mark Lamont Hill. Here is a question for you, and write this down. What was the role that Clarence Thomas had when he was going to school? Well, was he on the Supreme Court? Did he have a responsibility to, in fact, interpret the Constitution at that point? He was a student, right? Okay, fine. That's one role. When he's appointed by George Bush Sr. to the Supreme Court, which the liberals tried to stop with all kinds of innuendo. We've seen, what have you done to my song? We saw that song again with Herman Cain. And we had been to that dance before with the kinds of accusations made against Clarence Thomas, where he tried to stop him the same way. I mean, this stuff was from the sewage. And Biden was part of that, and all of these other persons that did this innuendo and trial by, it was what Clarence Thomas called it. It was electronic lynching, and no proven allegations. And nobody wanted to listen to those blacks that worked with both these people and what they said about what was going on there. Okay, that's a whole different discussion. But what I'm saying about Clarence Thomas is that the point is that your role changes. You can have all kinds of views about a lot of things until you take the oath of office, and his oath tells you that you must do. You must faithfully carry out and execute the Constitution of the United States. Had he taken an oath before anywhere? Maybe on the other bench, because he came from the lower court, I think from the circuit court to the Supreme Court. But you are sworn to uphold the Constitution. And if you show me in the Constitution where it allows you to say that you can discriminate and don't apply the 14th Amendment, which is the equal protection of the laws, now that it can benefit you to twist the laws and make it favor one group against another, and you can do that to your benefit. If you can show me how that is stated in the Constitution, I would, eat the words on the page. But that's not what it says. And what they wanted to do was get him up there to do what George Wallace did, or what they did before he arrived on the court, what Thurgood Marshall was claiming should go on. Because that's Thurgood Marshall's position.
Well, I'd like to ask this. I mean, Yale and Harvard, if I recall history correctly, had blacks attending long before affirmative action was ever an accepted practice. Mm-hmm. So even if you attended Yale University before affirmative action was in place, which is around the Nixon administration, my memory serves me well, it was during his term. Of course, he had Republicans. The Republicans were a minority back then. It was the Democrats in the House and Senate. He was a Republican president. But the term itself, affirmative action, was coined. One of his speechmakers, mm-hmm. Nixon's speechmakers,
that's right,
coined it. So Yale did, and so did Harvard, and so did Princeton, and so the other universities on the East Coast had several black scholars that came out of there way before the mm-hmm. 1970s. Mm-hmm. So they're making it sound like his total being there at Yale was depending upon affirmative action. That's right, which wasn't the case.
Yeah, and he was there at the very formative parts of it before it became so. This affirmative action began to grow in terms of what it meant, which became quotas and diversity. I mean, this is an evolving idea. At the very beginning of it, and the way it was intended by Richard Nixon and others, was that we have to, in fact, make sure that when we are making these decisions, that we are taking affirmative steps to be more inclusive. It didn't mean to advantage a group to disadvantage of other groups. That's something that evolved into later on, when this whole idea that you had to have so many people from this group and so many people from that group in there, and all of a sudden affirmative action is not affirmative action anymore. What it is discrimination under another name, and that's not the intention of it. And if anyone should, in fact, reject it, it should be blacks, because we argued against that premise before. And I think the Clarence Thomas position is a lot more principled than what you had with Thurgood Marshall, because I can remember when I remember reading in the book called Simple Justice by, I'm trying to think of the name of the authors of the book, but it's a forerunner to the book that I read before I got the book that was written about the Brown, where I had the transcript of the Brown case in it, the landmark decision of Brown versus Board of Education. But when I read this book by Klugman is the author of the book, called Simple Justice. And when I read that book, it had in it, and also the book by this one is these names don't come quite as close, don't come up quite as fast now. But another book that came out quotes conversation between William O. Douglas, who was a liberal on the court, and also Thurgood Marshall. And here's what Marshall was asked to do by William O. Douglas that decided with Marshall when he argued the Brown case in 1954. He said to Thurgood Marshall, I want you to side with me in terms of ruling that affirmative action is discriminatory, because that's the argument you made before the Supreme Court. And Marshall looked at William O. Douglas and said, look, you white folks have been discriminated against using discriminatory policies all these years. There's now our time. And when he said that, and I read that Thurgood Marshall had stated that, I was through with Thurgood Marshall at that point. Because you can't not talk out of one side of your mouth, and then when you get the power to rectify it, talk out of the other side of your mouth if it in fact disadvantages you. Let me make another point. I heard that O.J. Simpson is fasting unto death. Well, those of you who know about Emmett Till, in 1955, because Emmett Till murders, let me tell you what happened when that decision was made. There were no whites around the courtroom shouting, and there were no people cheering on television. Go look at the pictures there. You don't see any celebration going on. Maybe the people that were in fact exonerated, but you don't see no widespread celebration in Mississippi. And Mississippi was really the heart of Dixie if you take it out of Alabama's hands. But when O.J. Simpson, who was notably guilty of killing Nicole Brown and Ron Goldman, and black people knew it, that's why they were out there celebrating, and they were cheering that decision, knowing that he had gotten away with murder of two people. You cannot, on the one hand, have any principles in condemning one murder, and it should be condemned because it was wrong to kill Emmett Till, a 15-year-old boy. But you cannot, on the one hand, condemn that and then be up there acting like you're at a football game cheering when it happens in the other case. I condemn both. And if O.J. Simpson, who was locked up for another matter, but should have been in jail before that for the murder of those two persons, is fasting unto death, that's his decision to make. And I would not intervene with it, to be honest with you. I don't want anybody to die unnecessarily. But if that is a choice that he made because he's saying that he has always lived his life the way he wants to live his life and always had the freedom to do so, and that he will choose the way he would die as well. If that's his choice, that's his choice. That's sovereignty of his own space. But in terms of, I had been on the jury, I'm just telling you how I would have responded to it. If I had been on the jury, I would have held out until the cows came home. Because O.J. Simpson, if I'm on that jury, is going to jail as long as I have breath in my body, and I'm not going to let anybody in that jury room tell me to do what they did in that case, and that was dismiss the evidence, because the evidence was crystal clear. And when I would say that in my classes at different universities, the blacks in the classroom would knowingly kind of laugh. They knew what I was saying was true, but they were surprised that I would say it in the public arena. Because you say that in the barber shop, but you don't say it out in public. I'm saying it out in public. Because when I'm speaking the truth, I don't care who opposes it. I don't care how you feel about it. I don't care how many of you object to it. It doesn't bother me that the objections are there. In fact, I invite the objections, because if I know something to be true, that's been my great my great impediment. That once I know something to be true, then I'm going to say it if I know it, and that's just the way I am. That's the way I roll. We are going to continue this discussion about Black History Month and some of the history of it. I'm going to give you some names next week, some of the people that we can identify with during this month that would make the country proud, make the world proud. And We will engage this conversation more fully next week as we close out the month of Black History Week. Until that time, we want you to, as always, follow your dream, because if you don't follow your dream, you'll never know what's on the other side of the rainbow.